All right, everyone. Good evening. It is so good to be here with you all on this Tuesday night for the first in a series of in-person Bible studies that we'll be doing connected to this wider Bible in 100 Passages series that we've been participating in as a church this fall. For those of you who I haven't met, my name is Matt Helms, one of the associate pastors here. Blessing to have you here with us as we cover an ambitious topic. I realized after assembling this series, and I wanted to do a monthly Bible study in connection to this, and then I sat down and looked at 3 series to cover all 39 books of the Old Testament, and I thought, what have I done? But as we get into the text, I know that we will not be able to get into the level of detail that perhaps some of us will want. I would love to continue having some of these conversations with you, whether around tables or in the days ahead. But one of the approaches that we're going to take both in this session and over subsequent sessions as we get into November and December as well, we're going to be approaching the Old Testament through 3 distinct sections, following what in Hebrew is known as Tanakh, which is Torah, which is covering these first 5 books of the Bible, which is what we'll be discussing tonight. Nevi'im, which is prophets, and so that prophet section will be our most ambitious one coming up in November. There's a lot of material to cover there. And then finally, Ketuvim, which is writings. So this Tanakh, Torah, Nevi'im, Ketuvim, is one of sort of these ancient ways of organizing these 39 books of the Bible. And so our task tonight is to cover the first 5 as best we can. So looking forward to doing so. We are on day 24 of this Bible in 100 Passages series. I hope that many of you have been able to follow along. If you have not heard of this at all, there are handouts out in the hallway, and I promise it is not too late to begin reading them. One of the beauties of this is you are welcome to jump in at any part of this process, and it's going to continue to live on our website, I guess probably forever, but for the foreseeable future, and so do hope that you will join in with that. To date, we are just wrapping up Exodus in this wider series, and so part of what we'll be discussing is passages from Genesis and Exodus. To have those 2 out of 39 be almost a quarter of the text just goes to prove how foundational both Genesis and Exodus are for all that is to come in the text. We'll be dipping our toes into Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy in the days to come. But really, for the purposes of tonight, we're going to be trying to talk about the 5 of them as a whole and as a unit, and part of unpacking a little bit about what these texts are trying to do and communicate. Now, I want to start by sharing a little bit about these words Torah or Pentateuch that you may have heard of but may not know what they mean. Torah comes from this Hebrew word. The literal meaning of it is to teach, although over time it became equated with law based off of how the Greek translated the Hebrew. And so understanding Torah as translating to teach or law is probably one of the best and more succinct ways to understand that. You may have also heard of this fancy term Pentateuch before and thought, well, that sounds wonderful. It literally just means 5 books. That's in Greek, it means 5 books from the penta and then tukos. And so it sounds a lot fancier than it really is. But this understanding of these being a distinct unit within the biblical text goes back all the way to the Septuagint, which is really important in the history of Bible transmission. It was the first time that the Hebrew Scriptures were translated into a different language, being translated into Greek, as that became more dominant throughout the empire rather than an understanding of biblical Hebrew. And so this setting aside of these 5 books is sort of a very historic way of understanding these texts. Now, I mentioned this 3rd century BC. This text that you're about to see is one of, if not perhaps the oldest text that we have discovered as part of the Dead Sea Scrolls. I'm sure many of us have heard of that pretty incredible discovery. Took place in a cave that was on the west bank of the Dead Sea, was happened upon by Bedouin shepherds. And they had no idea at first exactly what they had. They began selling them until over the course of a decade, groups of archaeologists and scholars began to realize what an incredible treasure trove of well-preserved texts there were out in the desert. To date, I believe there have been around 15,000 scrolls or scroll fragments found from this collection in Qumran. And the reason why this is so important is that this is some of the earliest attestations that we have of things from the Pentateuch, from other parts of the Hebrew Bible. And it shows this history of text transmission and how it has been passed down. It really is a remarkable thing. And believe it or not, these texts are actually continuing to be worked on and translated today. I was just reading an article about how people are using AI for texts that have been heavily damaged to help reconstruct and understand them. So this work is currently ongoing. It's really amazing. But for the purposes of what we are going to be looking at and covering these 5 books, the major things to know about this arc that we are on, many of us, obviously, I'm sure, are familiar with Genesis. The word Genesis comes from this Greek word meaning origins. Interestingly enough, there are different titles for all of these within Hebrew. In almost every single case, it corresponds to the very first word of the text in Hebrew. And so Bereshit, in the beginning, is what the book is called within the Hebrew text. We know it as Genesis. Same thing goes for Exodus, coming from a Greek word meaning the way out. Captures very well the first half of that book of people going from slavery to being led by Moses out and into the wilderness, where that journey unfortunately continues for quite some time afterwards. Leviticus comes from a word in Latin meaning referring to Levi's tribe, the priestly tribe, and this understanding of sort of a priestly caste and an understanding of particular purity laws and a whole host of other things are really one of the major underpinnings of the book of Leviticus. There's not a lot of narrative that takes place within the book of Leviticus. If anyone's tried to read through the biblical text in order before, I'm sure you've discovered that. Things really kind of hit the brakes. But it's incredibly important for understanding this question that we'll talk about a bit later of what does it mean to live a holy life? People were really wrestling with that question, and that's something that I think Leviticus does a great job of asking us today. You also have the book of Numbers, the only one that comes directly from an English word, but arithmoi, I believe, is part of the Latin. That refers to 2 censuses that take place within the book. And so if you've ever wondered why it's called Numbers, it has to do with the censuses that take place. In Hebrew, it is instead about the wilderness. In the midbar, in the desert, in the wilderness is the setting there. And then finally, Deuteronomy comes from a Greek word meaning second law. This book is actually structured around a series of 3 sermons that Moses delivers. I guess you could call them discourses, sermons, any number of other things. If you're looking for a way to equate that, it's almost like Jesus' final discourses that you read in the end of the Gospel of John. It's almost like Moses' final words of wisdom to the people, and that is the bulk of the book of Deuteronomy. And so what you have within these texts is this movement from prehistoric origins, before history, all the way through God's consistent presence with the people on their way to Egypt and out of Egypt as they make their way to a promised land, returning to a covenant that is given to Abram in Genesis 12 that begins all of this. It's a beautiful thing, and it's an incredibly cohesive series of 5 books, even as there's a lot of variation within it. So one of the things that you may be curious about and are asking yourselves is, how did these 5 books come into being? Going back throughout history, there is no attempt, unlike some of the other biblical books that we have, to ascribe an author to this text. But around the 3rd century BC, there began to be a tradition building up that Moses was the one to have written all 5 books of the Bible and to have written them as a cohesive unit. You will find this view still within some Orthodox communities as well as some conservative Christian communities as well. But as you start to pick apart and unpack the text, there are a lot of issues with thinking of Moses as being the sole author. Not to deny that pieces of what he may have written or spoken are present. I almost believe that is the case. But to think of this as a wholly finished unit that Moses himself wrote, there are challenges to that. None greater than the last part of Deuteronomy, which talks about Moses' death. Now, we'll leave that aside. But there's also questions about why would Moses be writing in the third person? Why do particular passages use completely linguistic, there's massive differences between how they're written, from the syntax to the language and otherwise. It seems like there are enough seams that there is more than one author involved. And trying to work with and explain that over the years has been one of the great thorny questions that has existed within biblical scholarship. We'll talk a little bit about some of the proposed solutions, not because I believe that it's important for you to know it, but that I think it's a good representation of how we, as both readers of the text, but also scholars and interpreters, have been wrestling with how all these books fit together with one another. But for me, the most important thing to walk away with is that these 5 books are a beautiful collection of both oral and written sources that almost certainly span over a number of centuries. While they may have reached their final form in that 100-year span that you see there, 450 to 350 BC, there are almost certainly aspects of this tradition that have been handed down for generations upon generations. And in fact, we'll get to a beautiful example of that in a little bit. But one example I would lift up is the Song of Miriam that appears after the dramatic crossing of the Red Sea, thought to perhaps be one of the oldest texts within the Hebrew Bible itself, based off of how the Hebrew is written. It may date back to 12,000 BC. Amazing and beautiful. And so that's just one small example of how these books, even as we read them, have layers of history and beauty between them. And I think that's an incredible thing. But in terms of how scholars have looked to sort of unpack and explain how they may have come into being, one thing, if you've ever picked up a scholarly commentary on Genesis or any of these other books, you may have come across something called the documentary hypothesis with these lovely letters J, E, D, and P. Now, I'll try my best to explain a little bit about what is going on here, but the easiest way to think about it is that scholars have identified what they see as being 4 primary sources that feed into this final version of the Pentateuch or the Torah. There's what's called a Yahwist source, that J and Y are sort of transposed sometimes within Hebrew, but this Yahwist source really emphasizes God by the divine name, what's sometimes called the Tetragrammaton or Yahweh. This understanding of God as being given that name, the divine name revealed to Moses in the burning bush, that there is a particular source that emphasizes over and over of God's name being assigned to that special and holy name. There's also another source that was identified, and we're going to unpack because scholars aren't so sure about this today. But historically, there was an understanding of another source which referred to God almost exclusively as Elohim, which is a way of capital G God or sometimes lowercase g gods. It was a very versatile term and may have roots even earlier within the ancient Near East. You also have a Deuteronomist source that was very interested in creating not only this connection with the law, but an associated history as well. I'm sure all of this chart is probably not helpful, but I'll do my best to explain. If you see all the way in the bottom right, there's this DH. That stands for Deuteronomist history. That there is a lot of linguistic parallels between Deuteronomy and the books of 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings. There seems to be a tie and may share a similar source there, and so this Deuteronomist may have been an important piece of that. You also have this piece, the priestly source, or P. Leviticus would certainly be the primary example, but you see it woven out other texts as well, that there's a source that seems very interested in the law and legal code, but it also is where we get many of the lengthy genealogies that I know are all near and dear to our hearts. The priestly author seems to have been very invested in making sure that those things were a part of this as well. So this complex stew of combining, redacting, adapting, and eventually reaching this final form that you see at the bottom, Torah. From the view of scholars, this would have been taking place over successive centuries. It's hard in some cases to estimate this, but there would have been periods of redaction and combining in which these texts were being brought together. And this theory of how the Bible, or I should say, how the Pentateuch came into being was dominant for decades and decades within the 20th century. Recently, though, there has been some pushback on this and some challenge, namely because this looks too complicated. One of the big trends within biblical scholarship is to not posit complicated solutions when more simple ones are available. And so there has been a building understanding of something called the supplementary hypothesis. You all can stop me if I'm just doing too much jargon. Please put your hands up and tell me. All right. So the supplementary hypothesis, the easiest way to think about this is almost like a snowball, that there is a core text that under this theory would have been actually the Deuteronomists. You remember from the last one that would have been somewhat late. That this source would have actually reached about its final form in the 7th century. And that rather than having this interweaving of sources, there were a couple waves in which major pieces were added onto it rather than completely woven through it. And so you have this Yahweh source is one that would have been added likely or around the time of the Babylonian exile. And that date is an important one. 586 is this real watershed moment within the history of Israel, and it has been used a lot in trying to date some of these texts. And then you also have, after the people return from exile, is when you get this major emphasis on a return to the law, a return to sort of attaching to our roots. And this priestly source would have been sort of one of the final phases of this. And so as the theory goes, this is a much easier explanation, not only for the unity that we see throughout these 5 books, but it explains how there could have been additions over time that would not have that complicated soup that you saw on the previous slide. So that is I would say, arguably one of the kind of building viewpoints among scholars today. But there's also a third one that ultimately I would say is not particularly satisfying in that it's incredibly complex, but sometimes the complex answer can be the right one as well. And that is that there are dozens and perhaps hundreds of different independent oral and written traditions that in a couple of different time periods were placed together and there are many different iterations of this, but the most common one would be that prior to the Babylonian exile, there was an attempt to bring a lot of these different texts together in what's called the Deuteronomic phase. And then following the exile and that return, again, we have this priestly phase in which there's another attempt to sort of bring a lot of these texts back together. This fragmentary hypothesis works insofar as you can recognize all these different strands and the complexity of how broad these stories are. What it doesn't explain is when you read through the Pentateuch, there is a fair amount of continuity that stitches all of it together. And the fragmentary hypothesis, this lovely bowl notwithstanding, doesn't explain that sense of unity out of fragments that I think you can clearly see from the text. So I'm going to quickly pause before discussing this amazing thing. I would open up for any questions that anyone might have. I see Micah with a question all the way in the back.
When you talk about these texts were brought together and consolidated from different areas, it seems like everything was really diffused. There was no central library, there was no Wikipedia, how are these texts kept on what substrate, what kind of surface? Who knew enough? How many people could read them? How did they bring these together and keep them in any way that we can make sense of?
Yeah, so for those who are online, the question was about how these texts were transmitted, where they were centrally stored, who had the ability to understand them, all sorts of things. The short answer to that is that copying scrolls was incredibly complex, laborious, and all these sorts of things. In order to transmit a scroll and to write that down would take hundreds of hours of work in many cases. This time period, it was not as easy as making photocopies. It was painstaking work to transmit these texts. That's part of why oral transmission has been such a dominant and important part of not just within ancient Hebrew culture, but cultures around the world. But these texts would have, especially as the kingdom became centralized under the united monarchy, and even in the days afterwards, from the time of the temple and Solomon to afterwards, there would have been a sort of centralized priestly caste who would have been responsible for continuing and transmitting this wisdom down through the ages. And so, complex as it may be, I couldn't speak to how many in antiquity, how many of these scrolls, they weren't using paper, they were using things like stretched animal remains and otherwise. Vellum is the name that's coming to mind, but I might be making that up, so please don't quote me on that. There are a variety of different writing surfaces than what we might imagine and experience. So, good question. Yes, Sam.
We have different groups here. Deuteronomy, text, and all this.
Yes.
Does that mean that some of the stories of the Bible, creation stories, Noah, Abraham, in different times, and never, were those all made at the beginning and at the end, or
Yeah, it's a great and fantastic question that unfortunately has no easy answer, and you'll get different answers from different scholars. Sam's question was about when we read through the biblical text, and so you move from creation to Adam and Eve to Noah's Ark, are these different sources being woven together? In some cases, most scholars would make the argument that yes, particularly with creation and Adam and Eve, there seems to be two different sort of creation stories going on there. They likely came from different sources. However, like I was saying, there are so many different, whether it's verbal or otherwise, thematic through lines through them, that someone did an excellent job of weaving these various, whether they were oral or written traditions, together into a unified whole. And so while you can pick out certain passages as belonging to one of those schools, you'll also have other scholars who will look at that and say, I think you're overstating your case. And that's just part of the complicated push and pull that's existed with these texts as people have tried to understand that. It's rarely so clear-cut that you can read a passage and 100% be certain it falls into one of those four categories. It's really difficult. It's a great question. Yes, Lindy. Yeah, so a question about this J versus E source, the Yahwist versus Elohist. It's a great question because over the last, I would say, 3 to 4 decades, scholars actually deny that completely these days, that it's not anywhere near as clear-cut as was once stated, and sometimes these different sources seem to use the terms much more interchangeably than was once thought. And so I share this with you only to say this has been part of the history of how we've understood it, but most scholars today would actually really push back against those being very distinct from one another. So it's a great question. All right. Well, I am really excited to share with you all, talking about this history of text transmission. This, to me, is one of the most amazing archaeological discoveries in biblical history, and I don't even mean that. It sounds hyperbolic, but I genuinely mean it. In 1979, in a place on kind of I believe it's in the southeast of the old city of Jerusalem, there was a discovery made by a 13-year-old, which is incredible, who was volunteering with an archaeological dig and was told to clean up one of the burial caves that were there. These had site that they were working on, discovered a whole hidden room containing lots of different, a whole host of things. But the most remarkable discovery to come out of this was a set of 2 small silver amulets that had been rolled up really thin. They were almost 100% silver. And embossed on them, this took a long time to get because they couldn't be unrolled. They were so fragile. But were able to read the text. Now, it's hard to make out from here, but what scholars discovered was that this was almost like a what's called Proto-Hebrew. This is ancient Hebrew, even beyond some of what we might recognize today as biblical Hebrew. And when these silver amulets were dated, it was discovered that they came from somewhere around the 7th to 6th century BC. It is by centuries the oldest thing we have connected to the biblical text. But what makes it all the more remarkable is that you can barely make out, and as you can see, there's the reconstruction all the way on the right side. This is a silver amulet that is recording an ancient version of a passage from Numbers chapter 6 known as Aaron's blessing. May the Lord bless you and keep you. May the Lord make God's face to shine upon you and be gracious to you. May the Lord turn God's face to you and give you peace. The fact that this was dated to the 7th century, it doesn't suggest that all of Numbers had been written down by that point. But to see that through line of connection dating back centuries before anything that we had, it's one of the truly most remarkable things that I think we have. And I hope to go see them in person one day. It's a museum in Israel, I believe. It's truly one of the more remarkable things we have. And for me, once I learned about this, I've tried to use that as sort of the benediction anytime I lead a service, because I think there's such a beauty to that sense of a connection to a tradition that dates back 2,700 years, to know that someone had this wrapped up that would have been buried with them. What an incredible thing. And to me, that feels like a perfect transition point out of why we still read these 5 books, why they are still so important to us. The history, the transmission, all of that is interesting and fascinating. And believe me, I love it. But the interest of it, to me, pales in comparison to the purpose of why we, over 2,500 years later, why this continues to be God's living word to us, why it continues to speak to us and matter. For me, the easiest way, as I thought to sort of sum up these 5 books, is that they help us understand more about who God is, that they help us understand who we are as people. And at their best, and sometimes we see humans at their best, sometimes at their worst, they help us understand who we as humans are aspiring to be. And for me, these 3 things are core to why we continue to open our Bibles, to read, to do this Bible in 100 Passages series. They are teaching us these texts are teaching us all 3 of these things. And so I wanted to take a little time to unpack a little bit about what is coming out of these major sections within the text, starting with what is known as the prehistory portion of Genesis. Now, named prehistory because the texts within them aren't giving hard and fast dates. They're whether it's creation or Noah's Ark or otherwise. These are before what we would think of as recorded history. Now, there's so much more that we can learn than just these few things. But as we think about who God is, the way that Genesis, the first chapter, grounds us, and that God is the creator of all that is, was, and ever will be, what a powerful statement right at the very start of the text about who God is, that creator, but also sustainer. But we get, as the chapters go by and as we get into the end of the time with Noah and Noah's Ark, this idea that God is in covenant with all of creation is an incredibly important through line, not just throughout Genesis, but the entirety of both the Old and New Testament. This understanding of this promise and connection that God has with God's people. In terms of who we are, we are a complicated mix. We are made in the very image of God, the first chapter of Genesis tells us. One of the more remarkable statements, I think, in all of Scripture, that human beings are made in the very image of God. And yet, as we learn a few texts later, we're made of dust, and to dust we shall return. Human beings are divinely gifted, and they are stubbornly flawed. We are complex people, and so much of Genesis, so much of the Pentateuch speaks to that. In terms of who we aspire to be, we see over and over, especially in the prehistory, we have a deep desire to be like God. Being made in the image of God is not enough. We want to be like God, knowing all there is to know. And as the Tower of Babel puts it, we want to make a name for ourselves. There's a sense of pride and desire there. And that tension will appear over and over throughout not just Genesis, again, but throughout all of the Hebrew Bible. Now, as we get on to Abraham and his descendants, again, we talk about this idea of covenant as being a running through line throughout so much of the text. This idea of an everlasting covenant being made between God and Abraham and his descendants is a very powerful, unlike the universal covenant made with Noah, this is so much more specific and with all that is to follow in the generations after. And then for me, one of the other favorite lines of Scripture that are in the text, at the very end of all that Joseph and his family has been through over the course of 13 chapters, as Joseph repairs this relationship with his brothers that had been broken in Genesis 37, though you intended to do harm for me, God intended it for good. To have that be one of the summary sentences at the end of this epic journey in Genesis, I have always found this so compelling and beautiful, of even when human beings are, whether through jealousy or otherwise, seek to do harm, God is still able to work through us for good. And I think that is such an uplifting and hopeful idea. With God's words to Abram before he became Abraham, understanding that he is blessed in order that he might be a blessing, that's powerful language as well, and is challenging for us, understanding that because God has blessed us, we are meant to be a blessing unto others. What a beautiful idea and statement that is. But we also see on the flip side, continuing to have this desire to be God, to be in control. You see Jacob wrest control from his older brother Esau, older brother by all of a minute, but that's notwithstanding. Joseph you can see him as arrogant and boastful as he tells his older brothers and his family that they will bow down to him. Granted, he's just interpreting a dream, but you almost see this desire to be in control and power. That's something that continues to pop up over and over again in the text. And then moving on as we get into Exodus, you see God is committed. I have observed the misery of my people in Egypt. There is a clear desire and understanding that God not only is involved in the act of creation, God is present in sustaining creation and protecting and looking out for the most vulnerable in our midst. What an incredible statement and power. And even beyond that, going on, again, from this time period of the burning bush, this revealing of the divine name, I am, that word Yahweh that we mentioned earlier that gets translated as I am, that understanding of God's divine name is an incredible thing that comes out of this. We are, and this again gets into that beautiful dichotomy, God tells Moses, I'm going to send you to Pharaoh to bring my people out of Egypt, that we have been given a gift, we have been given a calling. And the first words out of Moses' mouth is, who am I? Surely all of us can relate to that, this feeling inadequate for the call that God has placed in our lives. And yet going all the way back, we're made in the image of God. We've been gifted by God. We're called to use those gifts. And Moses quickly will discover that he was the person that God had called. I've always loved those verses being back to back with one another. It represents so much about who we are as people. going on a little bit, and I know I'm racing through this, and I apologize. This is only going to get harder as we get into the prophets, but that's neither here nor there for now. Talking about as we cover the rest of the text from after the Red Sea all the way up until the people are standing on the cusp of entering into this land that was promised all the way back to Abram. Again, this idea that God is walking with them, sustaining them through this journey, making sure that the people are not sort of lording it over or seeking that control that we've been talking about, but making sure that they are caring for the orphan and the widow in their midst, making sure that they are building a society that cares for the most vulnerable, and frequent callbacks to how God helped the people in Egypt, therefore they need to do the same to others in their midst. A beautiful representation of who God is. And yet in the midst of that, the people are complaining. They grumble. They find idols, and we'll get into idol worship as we get into the prophets as well, and that being a continuous issue. People's response to God's act of faith continue to be complex and varied, and that certainly is a sustained through line through so much of the Pentateuch as well. But at our best times, at our best moments, I turn to that Numbers passage, that one from those silver scrolls. The Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make God's face to shine upon you and be gracious to you. This priestly blessing, this idea that God is looking to watch out for us, that we as a community are called to watch out for one another. What a beautiful thing to aspire to be. For that to be the oldest text that we have, what an amazing thing. And finally, you may have heard of this from someone who would come later named Jesus, but this is the original text. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your soul, and all your strength. Jesus was quoting this from Deuteronomy. He certainly was very well versed in all things in the Hebrew Bible. This sort of aspiration of who humanity is meant to be, I think, is really remarkable. And then this is the last slide before we just do a little transition, and I'm glad to open it up for questions as well. As you get into looking at the law and legal codes, I know if you look at all 613 commandments or mitzvot that are portrayed, and yes, there are 613. There's a lot of law and legal code that takes place within these texts. At the core of it, I believe, is this understanding that is shared towards the end of Exodus, that the Lord is merciful and gracious, slow to anger, abounding in steadfast love and faithfulness. There is a desire for the people to be holy, to be set apart. And we'll try to do a little unpacking about what that means, this understanding of holiness as being set apart from what is, I think is a really interesting concept that I'd love to explore a little bit more. But this understanding that we have a responsibility, that comes through so clearly throughout so many of, whether it's Leviticus or Numbers or Deuteronomy, that responsibility that we have to do our best to be holy is such an important through line of all of this as well, and to keep God's words close within our heart. That section of Deuteronomy 6, there's a famous, the Shema within Hebrew, this understanding that you're meant to hold on to God's law, to pass it down to your children, that aspiring to that in all that we do is so central to who we are. So to bring it all together, to sum it all up, and I will note, I was sharing all these stained glass windows. All of these actually come from a Presbyterian church in Michigan, in Muskegon, Michigan, which is amazing. I might take a field trip sometime. But part of why I was putting up these images is, for me, one of the ways that I have always thought about the Pentateuch or the Torah is almost through this lens of mosaic and all of these different written and oral traditions coming together to make this beautiful whole. To me, what a gorgeous representation of the way in which these ancient writers, these ancient oral storytellers who pass down these traditions over the course of generations, how that wisdom and understanding about who God is, who we are, and who we're called to be, what an amazing gift that is, and that's why we continue to read the text today. And as we'll see as we continue on through this Bible in 100 Passages series, so much of what we read in these texts, particularly Genesis and Exodus, but certainly in Deuteronomy and others as well, we are going to see references to these, appeals to these from whether it's prophets or otherwise, calling the people back to these central texts, reminding them of the promises that they've been given, but also reminding them of the expectations that God has for them as well. And so in that sense, even though these are only 5 of the 39 books that are contained within the Old Testament, these are crucial and foundational for understanding all that is going to be to come over the course of this series. So with that, I've been talking a lot at you. I would love to hear from you if anyone has any questions before we take a little time to talk in small groups, because I do want this to be a participatory space as well. Mike, you have another question already. Wow.
Well, it's an observation.
Okay.
The numbers, the word blessed and keep thee is the main sculpture over the front entrance of this church. There's a beautiful relief right above the front door. It's a 15-foot wide tympanum, and that whole passage goes over it and around it. So take a look sometime. It's a beautiful sculpture that nobody notices. It's up there kind of in the shade, right above the doors, but it's that exact passage.
I will confess that I did not know that as well, so I'm going to take a look at that. Number 6, over the course of the entrance to the sanctuary. Beautiful. Beautiful. Yes, Carol.
What were the windows exactly?
Oh, sure. Yeah, no, not a problem. So this one is Adam and Eve. You can see a couple apples up there. Should note, the Hebrew actually doesn't say apple. It says fruit, but that's neither here nor there. But so you have Adam and Eve, and so there's that. Noah's Ark over there. I don't know where Noah and the animals are, but that's okay. You can see sort of I believe that's supposed to be a representation of the dove. I love the chopping and churning of the water. Unfortunately, he's a little bit off frame, but I believe this is Abraham and Isaac and sort of that test of faith. Interestingly, I love this representation of what appears to be sort of an angel or angelic figure right behind him. What a beautiful, yeah, it's gorgeous. And then the other one, I believe, is Moses at the burning bush. Again, it's a little too zoomed in, but sort of prostrating himself on the ground and bowing before the burning bush. As follow-up to this class, I would be glad to send out, they have a website of all their stained glass, which is where I was pulling all of this shamelessly from, but a number of different texts throughout, not just the Hebrew Bible, but New Testament as well. So it's great. Yes, I believe so. I'll go back. Yeah, so this one, I believe, although I would need to look a little further into it. I don't want to make a proclamation about what it is, but I would imagine based off of, it looks as though it is a altar and sort of ritual. I was using it as a connection to law. Based off the dagger, though, there may be a chance that this is Elijah kindling the fire against the prophets of Baal. I may have just been blurring the lines a little bit, but.
The fact that there's a crown on the front of it means that.
Yeah. All right. Well, anyways. No, it's a good question. I'd be happy to unpack that all a little more at some point. Yes, Joy.
I've been struck in reading the devotions that there's a vengeance to God that doesn't come to me when I think about the New Testament.
Sure. Yeah, so question about why God is portrayed often as being vengeful. It's a complicated question, but I think what I would say as the most straightforward answer is that the time period in which these texts were being written were extremely challenging, violent, and in many cases, the human emotion in many ways comes out in the text. A lot of this desire for vengeance, Israel in the context of ancient Near East powers was so small. They were at the mercy of these larger empires. Many of the difficult things that befell them, whether the Assyrians or Babylonians or whatever it may be, they experienced a lot of suffering and things that were out of their control. No wonder so many of the passages are about human beings desiring control in a world in which they had none. But I think that ascribing vengeance and anger to God, this is me, or my personal view, is that for those writers, they were letting their own sense of vengeance seep into the text. And I don't say that to put down those who are writing. It's impossible sometimes to separate yourselves from that visceral reality that they experience day to day. And that's part of what makes some of the passages which are talking about God's forgiveness and abundance. You see texts that wrestle with each other about, is it good that God is gracious, or do we want a more vengeful God? And you see those texts in tension with each other within the biblical text. It's a really complicated question, but that would be my answer to it, I guess. All right, anyone else? All right, well, with that, we have 10 minutes on the clock, although please certainly feel free to have good conversation. I'm not going to be shooing you all out right at 7:30. But would love for you, if you have not had an opportunity to meet some of the folks around your tables, just to be able to share your name and where you live. We won't get to all three of these questions. I'll just be upfront about that. I talked longer than I meant to, but hopefully we learned a little something along the way. But I would be really interested to hear your response to this first one about a passage, whether from the Old or New Testament, that changed the way that you see or interact with the world around you. That's a tough question, if that feels like too much to unpack quickly around your tables. I'd be curious also to think about, I mentioned this desire to sort of unpack and think about what it means to live a holy life. Whenever I read Leviticus today, which granted I don't do frequently, but I still do read it, the question that always comes to mind for me is, what is God calling me? What is God calling forth? What is God calling the church to do to be set apart from the time that we're in? Not saying we should be completely divorced from everything that's going on outside our walls, but what are we called to push back on in our wider culture, in the way, whether it's interpersonally or systems that, like, whether I lift up sometimes the example of online shopping and all that goes in behind the scenes that you're never even aware of. I sometimes wrestle with that, and I'm not saying I have the right answer or wrong answer to that, but to me, these texts are asking these questions of, what does it mean to care for the most vulnerable in our midst? What does it mean to build a society in which no one is forgotten? Those are challenging questions, and while the answers back then look different than they might today, it's a worthwhile question, and I think is one that is really worth asking ourselves. And finally, if both of those don't really work for you, that's okay as well. I'd be curious to hear what has stood out to you for those of you who have been participating in this 100 Passages series. Like was just shared, things that really jump out to you from these texts that we've read, these 24 texts from Genesis and Exodus, and also what are you curious to learn more about as the series goes forward. So with that, I'll turn over to groups. Thank you to all of you, and if you'd like to come up and ask questions, would be more than happy to do so. Thanks to those who are joining us online as well. Very grateful for you. So thank you all so much. Appreciate it.